Alright, so I made a presentation about events leading up to World War II, and I wanted to start it off with a quote from Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the leader of Germany during World War I. It says, "This is a dark day and a dark hour. The sword is being forced into my hand. This war will demand of us enormous sacrifice in life and money. We shall show our fellows what it is to provoke Germany." And that's what he said when World War I started. And it shows the great national pride that Germany has, and it carries into World War II, which is something really important about the Second World War. So a little introduction. World War II is one of the most significant world conflicts in human history, and 194 countries were involved, whether they were neutral or not, they were somehow involved. Roughly 85 million reported deaths, and it's the bloodiest conflict of all time. And that took out about 2.3% of the 1940 world population, so it was really bad. So it's always referred to as the Allied versus Axis powers, and the big Allied powers were the US, UK, Free France, so France when it was occupied was half free and half Nazi, and then China, and then Axis was Germany, Japan, and Italy. And the point of this presentation today is, how did the bloodiest conflict in the world history begin? So I ordered this chronologically, so we're just going to work our way from the end of World War I to the beginning of World War II. So 1918, October 29th, the German Revolution against the Weimar Republic begins. The Weimar Republic was the German Republic, and so this is a picture of the revolution, just regular people armed themselves against the army. And then November 11th, which was today is known as Veterans Day, was the armistice with Germany, so it was a ceasefire with Germany. So Germany had to quit, but fighting actually didn't stop until 1924. 1919, January 15th, the German Revolution ends and the Weimar Republic ends with it. And then January 18th, the Paris Peace Conference begins, and these are the leaders of different countries meeting for the Paris Peace Conference. And then 6 months later, on June 28th, the Treaty of Versailles is signed, which is the official end of World War I. And then in July, Adolf Hitler, a young soldier from the Weimar Republic Army, infiltrates the German Workers' Party, which is a precursor to the Nazi Party. So a little more information on the Treaty of Versailles. It was signed on June 28th, 1918, and ended the war between the Allies and Germany. And so Germany, with the Treaty of Versailles, Germany wasn't allowed to keep a standing army. And within the Treaty of Versailles, it contained something called the War Guilt Clause, and this required Germany to be responsible for all damage caused by the Central Powers. And the Central Powers was essentially like the bad guys, if you're American. And so even the damage Germany didn't cause, they still had to pay for it. And so the reparations were valued at $31.4 billion, and today that would be $442 billion. And they actually, Germany as a country, just paid them off in 2014. So it took them a long time, and that basically left Germany in just an economic huge depression. And France and Britain wanted to punish Germany even further, but Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, convinced them not to. So 1920, Paris Peace Conference ends finally, and it ends with the first meeting of the League of Nations, which is like a precursor to the United Nations we have today. But the U.S. actually was the ones that said we should have the League of Nations, but never joined it because they wanted to stay neutral in all European affairs. So 1922, in March, the first German officers traveled to the Soviet Union to negotiate peace between the countries. And that's kind of like, before World War II happened, which I'll talk about later, Germany and the Soviet Union start to have a truce. This is the first start of the truce. And then in October, the Russian Civil War ends. It ends in a Bolshevik victory, and communism begins in Russia. And then October 29th, Mussolini is appointed as Prime Minister of Italy, which he was a big player in World War II. And then November 1st, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey abolishes the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire is now called Turkey, and as we know it today. So I want to focus more on Benito Mussolini and his rise to power. He was elected to the Italian Parliament in 1921. He was just a senator. But immediately he started making the voluntary militia for national security, commonly known as the Black Shirts. And they just, any labor and political strikes, they policed it and shut them down. And this caught a really big following in Italy. And on October 29th, 1922 was the March on Rome. And the government just gave Mussolini the prime minister spot. And he had such a big following in Italy that the government was scared of not giving him the prime minister chair. So in 1923, in June, Germany experiences the Great Inflation, and so their German mark, which is their currency, is completely worthless. And then July 21st, the Treaty of Lausanne determines the borders of Turkey, so it becomes the country we know today. And then November 8th, the Beer Hall Putsch takes place. A little more on the Beer Hall Putsch. Adolf Hitler led the National Socialist Party, which was that German Worker Party I was talking about earlier. They marched in the city center of Munich, and they countered the local police, and a fight broke out. 14 Nazis and 4 police officers were killed. And so Hitler was arrested during this event, and this was a very highly publicized trial, and it's the first time Hitler was able to get his word out on a national stage, which is very important. And then he was sentenced to 5 years in jail, and then within jail he wrote Mein Kampf, which is very important as well. And so not much happened between these 2 years, so I condensed them. January 21st, 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies, and Joseph Stalin starts purging his rivals. April 1st, Hitler is sentenced 5 years in prison, like we said before. And then August 16th, the Dawes Plan sets up a payment plan for Germany's reparations, because it's 1924 and 6 years after Treaty of Versailles, they haven't paid a dime. Then 1925, May 12th, Paul von Hindenburg is elected president of Germany, and that's him right there. He was a very important World War I general, and he is actually the man that helps Hitler get into power, even though he doesn't agree with the way Hitler sees things. And then July 18, 1925, Mein Kampf is published. A little more on Mein Kampf. It means my struggle in English, and it details how he became anti-Semitic and his future plans for Germany. And he became anti-Semitic because Germany was in an economic drought, and all the banks were owned by Jewish people. So he took that fact and misconstrued it as Jewish people are ruining the world and they need to be eradicated. And so that's how he became anti-Semitic. And then Volume 2 was printed in 1926 and became a bestseller in 1933, which is the year he got into power. And then it's just another platform for Hitler to spread his word on a national scale. So not a whole lot happened between these years, so I condensed it as well. April 24th, 1926, the Treaty of Berlin is signed, declaring Germany and Soviet Union neutral if either country is attacked. So Germany and Soviet Union both had their pacts with other countries, but if one of those countries attacked either country, they wouldn't get involved. Then September 8th, Germany joins the League of Nations. December 25th, Hirohito becomes Emperor of Japan, which that's him right there. And he was actually the guy that ordered the Pearl Harbor attack. And then November 12th, 1927, Leon Trotsky is expelled from the Soviet Union, leaving Joseph Stalin with absolute power. May 3rd, 1928, the Jinan incident, and Japan and Chinese take part in a small conflict, which is a precursor to just all the fighting that happens between Japan and China. There's a whole lot. And then 25 days later, China establishes their own standing army called the Red Army. And then on October 1st, Soviet Union launches its first 5-year plan, increasing industrialization and making it into the world power it is today. October 29th, 1929, Black Thursday, Great Depression occurs in the U.S. And then September 14th, 1930, Nazis become the second biggest political party in Germany. 1931, this is all about Japan invading Manchuria. It's called the Mukden Incident, the Japanese stage of fake flag bombing on a Japanese-owned railroad in Manchuria and blamed the Chinese for the attack. And so this is actually the beginning of World War II, but in the Pacific theater, not in the European theater, which I'm focusing on in this presentation. And then a day later, they invade Manchuria, and this is a picture of them invading. 1932, February 27th, there's fighting in Manchuria ends with a Japanese victory. April 10th, Hindenburg gets reelected as German president, beating Hitler by a pretty large margin, about 6 million votes. And then May 30th, the Chancellor of Germany resigns. So they had a Chancellor and a President for representing two different bodies of government. And then August 30th, Hermann Göring, who is a lieutenant of Hitler in the Third Reich, is elected chairman of the Senate. And then November 21st, Hindenburg begins talking to Hitler about forming new government. So he talks to the guy he beat in the last presidential election about restructuring the government. 1933 is a pretty big year. January 30th, Hitler is appointed as Chancellor of Germany. And then February 27th, Germany's parliament, the Reichstag building, is burned down by the Nazis. And then March 4th, FDR becomes president in the US. March 20th, Germany builds its first concentration camp, Dachau. March 23rd, German parliament passes the Enabling Act, making Hitler dictator. April 1st, Germans are encouraged to boycott Jewish shops and businesses. And then April 26th, the Gestapo secret police is formed in Germany. May 15th, Germany forms the Luftwaffe, which is known as their Air Force. And that is a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, so it was done in secret. July 14th, the Nazi Party becomes the National Party of Germany, so it's the biggest party in Germany now. And then in October 19th, Germany leaves the League of Nations. 1934, January 26th, Germany and Poland signed the Non-Aggression Act, which is a little ironic. And then March 20th, Heinrich Himmler, who is another lieutenant of Hitler's, becomes commander of the secret police. August 2nd, Hitler appoints himself as head of state and chancellor of Germany, basically known as the Führer. December 29th, Japan begins to build a massive naval fleet. 1935, June 18th, the UK decides to allow Germany to build a small naval fleet, and the UK said it's okay if they build 35% of what the UK has. And then August 31st, the US declares neutrality in the impending conflict, and then September 15th, the Nuremberg laws get passed, and that is the beginning of the persecution of Jewish people. And this is a kind of a flyer they handed out to a lot of German-born citizens. And so the black dots represent if you have a Jewish person in your family, and then so you can kind of track down the bloodlines and see if you're Jewish enough to be persecuted. Yeah, it was pretty bad. 1936, March 7th, Germany seizes the Rhineland, which is a mountain range in Austria. And then July 17th, the Spanish Civil War begins. December 1st, Hitler makes it mandatory for all males in Germany between the ages of 10 and 18 to join the Hitler Youth. So I wanted to focus on the Spanish Civil War a little more. It's commonly referred to as a proxy war, and the Republicans were supported by the USSR, and the Nationalists were supported by Germany and Italy. So that means the Republicans were communists, the Nationalists were fascists. And so the fascists ended up winning in 1939, and Francisco Franco was the leader of the Nationalists, and he became dictator after the victory until his death in 1975. A little cool story about the Spanish Civil War. There actually was this brigade called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and it was 3,000 U.S. soldiers who were just tired of sitting around in the United States. So they went over to Spain and fought on the side of the communists, actually, which is a little backwards than what most people would think, but back then, communism, like nobody was really scared of communism. They were more scared of fascism. 1937, January 20th, FDR begins his second term. And then May 28th, Neville Chamberlain becomes Prime Minister of Great Britain. Those two guys are the guys, FDR is the leader of the United States, Neville Chamberlain will be the leader of the UK when World War II begins. July 7th, the Second Sino-Japanese War begins, so that's a war between China and Japan. And then December 13th is the Rape of Nanking, which is probably one of the most brutal, swiftly brutal acts of civilian violence in the world's ever seen. 1938, March 13th, Austria is annexed by Germany. They say annexed and not invaded because the German military walked into Austria and all the Austrian people lined up and just like, hello Hitler, come on in. July 6th through 16th is the Evian Conference. It was a conference between the United States and the United Kingdom, and they refused to accept any more Jewish refugees. September 27th, FDR sends a letter to Hitler asking for peace, and then September 30th is the Munich Agreement, and Czechoslovakia gives Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for peace. November 9th is Kristallnacht. Thousands of Jewish shops and synagogues are burned and destroyed throughout Germany. So I wanted to focus more on the Munich Agreement. It was a meeting between the Nazis, France, and Italy, and the United Kingdom. They met in Munich to discuss terms of peace, and without the consent of Czechoslovakia, UK and France agreed to give Germany the Sudetenland, and the Sudetenland was where the Czechs had all of their military in place for defense against Germany had they invaded, and so they had to pull everyone out, And then this heightened tensions in Poland because the Sudetenland was the best way to get into Poland. And Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain, this guy right here, was regarded as a hero and celebrated as the man who put a stop to another world conflict. So this was a picture outside of like where he landed in an airport, and there was this huge group of people outside celebrating him, and he was like, this paper right here is the end of another world conflict, and he thought he was the one who ended it all, but he was a little wrong. And then Kristallnacht, it started because German diplomat Ernst von Rath was assassinated by a 17-year-old Polish Jew. It translates to the Night of Broken Glass. 267 synagogues were destroyed, 7,000 Jewish businesses were damaged or destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And this event actually sent shockwaves around the world. And for a lot of people, especially in the United States, this was the first experience they've heard of Jewish people getting persecuted around the world. So I have a video that shows what exactly happened that night.
By 1938, Adolf Hitler had been in power for 5 years. He had imposed his Third Reich, a police state, and his own personality cult. He was called Führer. Nazi fascist doctrine was racist and anti-Semitic. On the 7th of November, German diplomat Ernst von Rath was assassinated by 17-year-old Herschel Greenspan, a German-born Polish Jew resident in Paris, whose family was forced out of Hitler's Germany. The assassination was seized as a pretext during the night from 9th to 10th November for coordinated attacks against Jews throughout Nazi Germany. They lost any rights. The attackers were paramilitary forces and non-Jewish civilians. The police stood by. This was called Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass. Jews were murdered in the rioting. Tens of thousands would be transported to concentration camps. Thousands of Jewish-owned stores, buildings, and hundreds of synagogues were destroyed. Cemeteries were profaned. The worst was in Berlin and the Austrian capital, Vienna. Racial persecution grew. Commemorating that down chance, its 5th anniversary, Merkel called today's continuing need for police protection for Jewish institutions a sobering reality. The preparation for Hitler's extermination of the Jews, his final solution premise of an Aryan master race, included categorizing Jews and documenting them, or stripping them of documents, businesses, possessions. It had begun with laws against interracial marriage, banning Jews from employment, from state hospitals, schools, libraries, and parks, and it concluded in many death camps and gas chambers.
And last but not least, 1939, January 27th, Hitler initiates Plan Z, a huge program designed to build a huge naval fleet. And then April 14th, FDR sends another letter to Hitler and a letter to Mussolini asking for peace. May 11th, Japanese lose another Soviet-Japanese border conflict, influence them to leave the Soviets alone and turn their attention to the European and American powers. Then May 22nd, the Pact of Steel is signed. Italy and Germany form a military alliance. And then August 23rd, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed, allowing Germany to invade Poland without Soviet interference. And then September 1st, Germany invades Poland, marking the official start of World War II in Europe. Any questions? That's all I got.